My daughter and her husband lived in my house for 4 years. They received $80 million from my late husband, and I got an old garage. That same day, she kicked me out. Get out! We're rich now! But in the garage, I found a second real will, which stated that this was, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Martha Collins, and I am 68 years old. For 43 years, I lived in the same white house on Clover Street in Dayton, Ohio. The house where I raised my daughter, Diane, where I planted rose bushes along the front fence, where my husband, Gerald, and I drank coffee every morning on the back porch watching the birds. It wasn't a mansion. It was a 3-bedroom house with creaky floors and a drafty garage that Gerald always meant to fix. But it was mine. It was ours. And I loved it the way you can only love a place that holds your whole life inside its walls. Gerald was a good man, a quiet man. He worked 30 years as a civil engineer, saved carefully, invested wisely, and never talked about money at the dinner table because he said money was a tool, not a personality. When he died of a heart attack in March of last year, standing at the kitchen sink, washing his coffee mug just like any ordinary Tuesday, I felt the floor go out from under me. We had been married 45 years. I didn't know how to be a person without him. Diane and her husband Trent moved in 6 weeks after the funeral. She said it was to help me. She said I shouldn't be alone in a big house. She brought casseroles and spoke softly and held my hand at the kitchen table while I cried. I was grateful. I was foolish. Looking back now, I can see exactly when the help stopped being help and started being something else entirely. But grief does something to your eyes. It blurs the edges of things. The first sign came about 3 months in. I noticed that Trent had started going through Gerald's desk in the study. Not casually, methodically. Folders pulled out, replaced, stacked differently. I asked him once what he was looking for. He smiled that wide smile of his and said he was just getting organized, helping out. I didn't push. I should have. The second sign came when Diane began taking calls in the bedroom with the door closed. She'd done that before. She was a private person, I told myself. But these calls happened late at night, and once, passing the hallway, I heard the word attorney. And then her voice dropped so low I couldn't catch another syllable. When she came out, she looked at me with a bright, practiced smile. "Just work stuff, Mom." I nodded and went back to my room. The third sign, the one I should have screamed at, was when I found the study locked. My own study, in my own house, with a new padlock on the door. Trent said he'd put it there to protect Gerald's papers from getting mixed up while they helped me sort through the estate. I stood in that hallway for a long moment, staring at that padlock, and felt something cold move through my chest. But I told myself, he means well. Diane means well. They are trying to help. I was wrong about that. The call from the attorney's office came on a Thursday morning in October. A man named Mr. Hale introduced himself as the executor of Gerald's estate. He told me in a careful, neutral voice that a will had been filed with the probate court. He asked if I had been informed of its contents. I said I assumed it was what Gerald and I had always discussed. The house to me. Savings split between me and Diane. There was a pause on the line, a pause that lasted just half a second too long. He said he would send the documents over. I read them at the kitchen table while Diane sat across from me, watching. The will, signed, notarized, dated 8 months before Gerald's death, left everything to Diane. The savings account, the investment portfolio, the life insurance payout. $80 million accumulated over a lifetime of careful, quiet work. And to me, the document listed in plain language the detached garage and its contents. I looked up at my daughter. She was already smiling. "Mom," she said, and her voice had changed. The softness was gone. It was flat now, certain. "Trent and I have been talking. This is our house now. We're going to need the space. She glanced toward the door. You should probably start thinking about where you want to go. I sat very still. Outside, a car passed on Clover Street. The rose bushes I had planted 20 years ago moved in the October wind against the window. Get out, she said, when I didn't move. We're rich now, Mom. We don't need to pretend anymore. I was 68 years old, sitting in my own kitchen, being told to leave my own home by my own daughter. And in that moment, something happened inside me that I did not expect. I did not cry. I spent that first night in the garage. Not because I had nowhere to go. I had a sister in Columbus, a friend 3 streets over. But I didn't call anyone. I sat in the cold garage on a folding chair Gerald used for fishing trips, wrapped in an old army blanket I found on a shelf, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Sometimes you have to sit inside the worst moment before you can start moving through it. The garage smelled like motor oil and sawdust and, faintly, like Gerald's work gloves. He'd spent a lot of time out here. Tools hung on pegboards, labeled in his neat handwriting. Mason jars of bolts, sorted by size. A workbench he'd built himself in 1987. This was his thinking space, he used to say. When a problem was too big for the kitchen table, he brought it to the garage. I looked around in the yellow light of a single bulb and thought, $80 million. Gone. My house. Gone. My daughter. The one I had sat with through chicken pox and broken hearts and a miscarriage she didn't tell her father about, the one I had driven to ballet and chemistry tutoring and college orientation. That daughter had looked me in the eye and told me to get out. How does a person process that? I didn't sleep. I made a mental list instead, the way Gerald taught me. He always said, when you don't know what to do, write down what you know. So I sat in the cold and I listed facts. Fact: a will had been filed that I had never seen before. Fact: Gerald and I had discussed our estate plan many times, and it looked nothing like what was in that document. Fact: Diane and Trent had been in Gerald's study for months with a lock on the door. Fact: the signature on the will was Gerald's, or appeared to be. And then I asked myself the question that changed everything. When exactly did Gerald sign that document? The will was dated 8 months before his death. 8 months before he died, Gerald had been healthy. Gardening, playing chess with our neighbor Bill on Saturday mornings. He had no reason to rewrite his will in secret, cut me out of everything we'd built together, and say nothing to me about it. We talked about everything. We argued sometimes the way married people do. About money, about Diane, about small things and large ones. But secrets? Gerald didn't keep secrets from me. Someone had kept one for him. I stood up from the folding chair. My knees ached from the cold. I walked to Gerald's workbench and ran my hand along the edge of it, the way I used to touch his shoulder when he was working. And then I noticed something I hadn't seen before, or hadn't looked at properly. On the underside of the bench's top shelf, where Gerald stored his most important small items in an old wooden box, the box was pushed further back than usual. Pushed, or hidden. I pulled it out. It was heavier than I remembered. Inside, under a layer of hardware receipts and an old fishing license, was a manila envelope. Sealed. My name written on it in Gerald's handwriting. Not typed, not printed. Written in blue ink in his careful, slightly tilted letters. Martha. For you. My hands were not entirely steady when I opened it. It was a will. A second will, dated 4 months after the one filed in probate. So 4 months before Gerald died. It was handwritten on 3 pages, signed, and notarized by a woman named Patricia Owens at a UPS store on the other side of town. Not the family attorney. A different notary entirely. I read it twice in the garage light. Gerald had left me the house. full ownership. He had left me half the savings and a letter of instruction for the investment accounts. He had left Diane a fair and generous inheritance, $3 million and his mother's jewelry. He had written, in a note at the bottom of the last page, in his own words, "I'm leaving this here because I don't trust the situation at home right now. If you're reading this, Martha, something went wrong. Get an attorney. Don't let them tell you this doesn't exist." I sat back down on the fishing chair. Gerald had known. He had suspected something, and he had been careful, and he had tried to protect me even from beyond whatever he feared was coming. The fear I'd been holding in my chest since Thursday morning didn't disappear. But underneath it, something else appeared. Something that felt, if I'm honest, like it had Gerald's name on it. I folded the envelope carefully, tucked it inside my coat against my body, and took out my phone. It was 4:47 in the morning. I found the number for Ohio Legal Aid, wrote it in my notes for morning, and then I found the number for a probate litigation attorney I'd seen mentioned in a community newsletter months ago. A woman named Carol Vance, who had a reputation, the newsletter said, for taking on fraud cases. I would call her when the sun came up. I was 68 years old, alone in a cold garage with everything taken from me. And I had a plan. Carol Vance's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled like old carpet and copy paper. The kind of office that told you she spent money on her work, not her furniture. She was 50-something, compact, with short gray hair and reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose. She did not offer me coffee. She opened a yellow legal pad and looked at me across the desk and said, "Tell me everything from the beginning, and don't decide for me what's important." I did. I told her about Gerald, the death, the 6 weeks before Diane moved in. I told her about the locked study, the late phone calls, the document filed in probate. Then I set the manila envelope on her desk. She read the second will carefully. She examined the notarization. She flipped to the last page and read Gerald's handwritten note twice. Then she set it down and looked at me over her glasses. "Mrs. Collins," she said, "do you understand what you're holding?" I said I thought I did. "If this document is authentic, and the notary stamp and Gerald's signature will need to be verified, then someone filed a fraudulent will in an Ohio probate court. That is not a civil matter. That is a crime." She paused. "A serious one." She agreed to take the case. We spent 2 hours going through everything I remembered. She explained the process. First, a forensic handwriting analyst would need to examine both wills. Second, she would contact Patricia Owens, the notary on the second will, to verify the signing. Third, she would file a formal objection to the probate proceeding, a will contest, which would legally freeze the distribution of the estate while the court investigated. "They'll know," I said. "When you file, Diane and Trent will know I'm fighting this." "Yes," Carol said, "they will. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the garage, the cold chair, Gerald's handwriting on that envelope. "I am," I said. What I didn't know, what I found out later, was that Diane had already noticed I was gone. Not gone the way she'd intended, meekly disappearing to a sister's guest room. Gone quietly. No calls, no pleading, no tears on the doorstep. Trent had apparently expected me to come back and beg. When I didn't, when the house stayed silent, and I didn't answer Diane's single text message, "Mom, where are you? We should talk." They started to worry. My neighbor Bill Garrett told me afterward that he'd seen Trent standing on the front porch 2 days after I left, looking up and down Clover Street with a specific kind of alertness that Bill described as like a man who lost something and wasn't sure if someone else had found it. Bill was 71, retired, and possessed of the sharp observational patience of someone who had spent 40 years as a high school principal. He didn't wave at Trent. He watched him. Meanwhile, Carol's investigator, a former county clerk named Ray Dutton, who did document work on the side, located Patricia Owens within 48 hours. Mrs. Owens, it turned out, remembered the signing perfectly. She was in her 60s, ran a small notary business out of the UPS store, and kept meticulous records. She had Gerald's ID photocopy, the date, the time. 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday in November. And she remembered Gerald specifically because he'd come in alone, asked for a glass of water, and sat for a moment before signing. He seemed like he was carrying something heavy, she told Ray. I asked if he was all right. He said yes. He just wanted to make sure he did this right. She had a carbon copy of every page. The forensic analyst, a woman out of Cincinnati named Dr. Sandra Bell, who testified in court cases, examined both documents. Her preliminary finding arrived in Carol's email 10 days after our first meeting. I read it sitting in Carol's office. The signature on document A, the will filed in probate, shows inconsistencies with known exemplars of the subject's handwriting, including variation in baseline pressure, letter formation in the surname, and pen lift patterns. The signature on document B, the handwritten will, is consistent with all available exemplars. It is my preliminary opinion that document A warrants further forensic examination for potential forgery. There it was. I sat with that word, forgery, and let it settle. My daughter had forged her father's will, or someone had forged it for her. Either way, she had known. She had let me sit at that kitchen table and read a document that was almost certainly fake. She had told me to leave my own house. She had looked at me, her mother, the woman who held her hand through every hard thing life had given her. And she had lied. Carol filed the will contest that afternoon. The probate court issued a freeze on the estate. Gerald's accounts, all of them, were locked pending investigation. That evening, my phone rang. Diane's name on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. She called 4 more times before midnight. The point of no return had been crossed. Not by me. I understood now that it had been crossed long before I ever found that envelope in the garage. I was simply the last one to arrive at the truth. But I had arrived. Carol had warned me they would escalate. People who've committed fraud don't sit quietly when they're caught, she said. Expect pressure. Expect it to be ugly. She was right on both counts. 3 days after the probate freeze, Diane called from a number I didn't recognize, presumably so I'd pick up. I did. I didn't speak first. I waited. Mom. Her voice was different from the flat, certain tone she'd used in the kitchen. This was something more controlled, careful. I think there's been a misunderstanding about Dad's will. Trent and we want to explain. Can we meet? Everything goes through my attorney, I said. Her name is Carol Vance. I'll give you the number. Silence. Mom, you're making a mistake. A shift in tone now, colder. Dad signed that will himself. You know that. You're confused because you're grieving and some lawyer is taking advantage of you. A pause. We don't want to have to tell the court that you've been exhibiting signs of cognitive decline since Dad died. The neighbors have noticed. Bill Garrett has already mentioned. Bill Garrett is my witness, I said, and has been for the last 2 weeks. Another silence. Longer. Don't do this, she said. Her voice had lost the careful quality now. Something raw underneath it. You will lose. You're 68 years old, and you're alone, and you have no idea what Trent is capable of. I hung up. My hands were trembling slightly when I set the phone down. I was sitting in the small room I'd been renting by the week at a place called the Clover Inn, 3 miles from Clover Street. It was a modest room, 1 bed, a table, a window overlooking a parking lot. But it was mine in a way the house had stopped feeling the moment I read that false document. I took 3 deep breaths. Then I called Carol and told her about the call, including the threat about cognitive decline. She told me to document it in writing immediately and email it to her. I did. The next move came from Trent, and it came in person. He found me at the diner on 5th, where I'd started having breakfast most mornings. I don't know if he followed me or asked around. Dayton is not a large city, and I'd lived there my whole life. He slid into the booth across from me without being invited, a large man in a good jacket, and he put both hands flat on the table and looked at me in a way that was meant to feel like a wall. "Martha," he said. He'd never called me by my first name in 4 years of living in my house. Always Mom, or when he remembered his manners, Mrs. Collins. "You've filed a contest," he said. "You've frozen Gerald's accounts. Do you understand what that means practically? Those accounts were going to be distributed. Diane was going to use that money to pay off a significant debt. A significant debt, Martha." He let that sit. "If those funds stay frozen while some court proceeding drags on for 18 months, certain people we owe money to are going to become very unhappy." I looked at him across the table. He was trying to frighten me with implications. Dangerous creditors, shadowy consequences. It was the kind of threat that counted on a 68-year-old widow not knowing exactly how frightened to be. "Trent," I said, "are you telling me that you and my daughter defrauded Gerald's estate to pay off a personal debt?" He blinked. He hadn't expected that framing. "I'm saying, because if that's what you're saying, you should probably be talking to a criminal attorney rather than to me." I picked up my coffee cup. "We're done here." He sat for another moment. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and left without another word. I paid for my breakfast, walked to my car, and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes. My heart was going faster than I would have liked. I was not made of iron. The mention of dangerous debts worried me, not for my own safety exactly, but for the shape of the problem. If Diane and Trent were in serious financial trouble, they were desperate. Desperate people make unpredictable choices. I called Carol, reported the conversation. She said 2 things: documented and good. Then she told me the forensic examiner had agreed to testify, and that Patricia Owens, the notary, had agreed to provide a deposition. "The case is solid," Carol said. "Don't let them rattle you." That evening, I drove to my sister Ruth's house in Columbus and stayed for 4 days. Ruth made soup and didn't ask too many questions, and let me sit on her back porch, wrapped in a quilt, watching her bird feeder for long stretches of time. I slept for 9 hours the first night, the first real sleep I'd had since October. I read a novel I didn't finish. I called Carol once a day for updates and otherwise put the phone face down on the guest room dresser. I needed those 4 days, not to hide, not to give up. To remember that I was a person with a whole life and not just a case number in a probate dispute. Gerald would have told me the same thing. Take the break, Martha. You'll need your energy for what comes next. He was always right about that kind of thing. When I came back from Columbus, there was an envelope under the door of my room at the Clover Inn. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with a number at the top. $2 million. And 3 sentences below it. We are prepared to offer a full and final settlement. You will receive $2 million and the legal costs of your filing, paid in full. In return, you will withdraw the will contest and agree to no further legal action. I read it twice. Then I photographed it, emailed the photograph to Carol, and put the paper in the folder where I kept all my case documents. $2 million. If I had been a different kind of person, a tired person, a frightened person, or simply a person who had never found that envelope under Gerald's workbench, $2 million might have felt like a rescue. It was more money than I'd ever had in my own hands. It would have bought me a comfortable life, a nice apartment, peace. But $2 million out of $80 million is not a settlement. It's an insult dressed in a suit. More importantly, it was an admission. You don't offer money to someone you believe has no case. Diane and Trent were scared, and that meant Carol and I were doing something right. I called Carol. They offered $2 million, I said. A brief pause. Decline it. Already planned to. She almost laughed. Good. Don't respond to them directly. I'll send a formal rejection through their attorney. I assume they filed this through counsel? It came unsigned under my motel room door. Longer pause. That's either sloppy or intentional. Either way, photograph everything. Preserve the envelope. Note the date and time you found it. She paused again. They're getting nervous, Martha. Nervous people make mistakes. Let them. I did. The offer must have been Diane's idea, because Trent's response to the rejection was to park his car on the street outside the Clover Inn for 2 evenings in a row. Visible from my window, just sitting there, not coming in, not calling. Just present. Watching. It was the kind of thing that was hard to report to police and easy to feel. I reported it to Carol anyway, who wrote a formal letter to Trent's attorney noting the behavior and using the word harassment. The parking stopped after that. It was during these days, the quiet, watchful days when Diane and Trent had stepped back into observation mode and Carol's legal machinery was moving forward without requiring me to do much, that I realized how alone I had allowed myself to become since Gerald died. Grief does that. It makes the world very small and very interior. Bill Garrett called on a Thursday evening. He'd gotten my number from Ruth, he said, and he wanted to check in. I'd known Bill for 22 years. His wife Joan had been my closest friend until she passed in 2018. We talked for an hour. He told me he'd already given a written statement to Carol's investigator about what he'd observed in the weeks after the funeral. Trent's methodical movements, the padlock on the study, the night he'd seen Diane loading boxes from the house into their car at 11 p.m., while Gerald had been dead less than 2 months. 11 p.m. boxes. What had been in those boxes? I should have told you sooner, Bill said. I didn't know if it was my business. It's your business, I said. You were Gerald's friend. I was, he said quietly. He would have hated this. There was a woman at my church, Grace Presbyterian, where I'd attended for 30 years, named Dorothy Hale. She was 81, sharp as a tack, and had run the women's Bible study for 2 decades. She had watched my marriage, attended Gerald's funeral, and sent me a card every week for the first 2 months after he died. I called her, finally, and told her the short version of what was happening. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "You come to the study on Wednesday. You sit with us, and you let us pray for this. And for you." I went. I sat in Dorothy's living room among 7 women between the ages of 60 and 85, and I let them pray. I didn't cry until the drive home, and then I cried for about 10 minutes and felt considerably lighter afterward. The legal process doesn't move fast. Carol had warned me of that. But it moves steadily if you have the right documents and the right people, and I was beginning to understand that I had both. What I didn't realize yet, what would become clear only later, was that Diane and Trent, watching from their distance, were preparing one more approach. Not a bribe this time. Something that looked, on the surface, much more like love. She came alone. That was the first thing that surprised me. Diane knocked on the door of my room at the Clover Inn on a Sunday afternoon, without Trent, without an attorney, with a paper bag from the Italian bakery on Maple Street, the one where we used to buy cannoli when she was a child. She was dressed quietly, no jewelry, hair loose. She looked tired. She looked, for a moment, almost like my daughter. "Mom," she said, "can I come in? Just to talk, nothing official, just us." I thought about Carol's standing instruction. Don't meet with them alone. Then I looked at my daughter in the doorway, holding a bag of cannoli, and I stepped back to let her in, because whatever I had decided, I had not decided to stop being her mother. She sat at the small table by the window. I sat on the edge of the bed. She opened the bag, set a cannoli on a napkin for me, kept one for herself, and for a moment we just sat there the way we used to when she came home from college, and we needed to ease back into each other before we could talk about anything real. "I know you're angry," she said. "You have a right to be. Things were said that shouldn't have been. Trent was under so much pressure, and I followed his lead when I shouldn't have." She looked at the table. "Dad's money was supposed to fix everything. I didn't think about what it would cost you. I'm sorry, Mom. I mean that." She sounded like she meant it. Did she mean it? I looked at her face. I had been looking at that face for 45 years. I had known it through every phase and change it had gone through, and I tried to find the truth in it. And the uncomfortable thing, the thing I want to be honest about, is that part of me wanted to believe her. Grief had made me lonely. The months at the Clover Inn had been quiet in a way that sometimes felt like punishment. She was my daughter. "Tell me something," I said. "The will that was filed in probate, did you know it wasn't the real one?" A silence. Fractional. Maybe 2 seconds. But I caught it. "Mom, Dad signed that will. Did you know it wasn't real?" She looked at me steadily. "You need to drop this. Not for my sake. For yours. The attorneys are going to drag this out for years. You're 68 years old. You could be spending this time at peace, with money to live comfortably, instead of fighting a legal battle you might not win." She leaned forward slightly. "You found some handwritten pages in a garage. That could have been anything. Dad used to write notes, drafts. You know that. My attorney says that document isn't going to hold up to the standard the court requires." There it was. Under the cannoli, under the soft voice, under the tired eyes. "You will lose, and you know it. So why not stop now?" "Your attorney," I said, "hasn't seen Dr. Bell's report?" Something flickered behind her eyes. "Who? It was good of you to come, Diane." I stood up. "Everything from here goes through Carol Vance. You have her number." She stood too. The softness left her face then, not all at once, but like a stage light slowly dimming. What was underneath it was not rage exactly. It was something colder, the look of someone recalculating. "You're going to regret this," she said. Her voice was quiet. Quiet is sometimes worse than loud. Not because we'll do anything, just because you're burning the last of this family down and you can't see it. When this is over, when you've made us all go through this, there won't be anything left between us. You understand that? I held the door open. She left without taking the cannoli. I closed the door and stood in the middle of that small room and let myself feel what was true. I was afraid. Not of the legal outcome. Carol had given me solid reasons for confidence. I was afraid of the thing Diane had named, the thing she'd used as a weapon precisely because it had a point. There won't be anything left between us. The family, whatever it had been, was already gone. Gerald was dead. The daughter I'd raised had forged her father's will. There was no version of this story in which everyone went home happy. But fear, I had learned that autumn is not the same as wrong. I picked up the cannoli she'd brought me, wrapped it back in the napkin, and sat down to call Carol. I told her about the visit, the line about Dr. Bell, which means they don't know the scope of the forensic report, and the veiled threat at the end. "Let her worry about what else you have," Carol said. "That's exactly where we want her." I said goodnight and set the phone down. Outside my window, Dayton was going dark in the November evening. Somewhere on Clover Street, my rose bushes were past their season, dormant in the cold. I thought about Gerald leaving that envelope in the garage. I thought about him sitting in the UPS store, asking for a glass of water, wanting to do it right. He tried to protect me. The least I could do was finish it. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in January, the kind of Ohio winter day when the sky is a uniform gray and the cold has a specific, serious quality to it. The Franklin County Courthouse, the case had been transferred there on procedural grounds, smelled like industrial cleaner and old marble. I wore the dark blue dress I'd worn to Gerald's firm's retirement dinner in 2019. He had said I looked like myself in it. That seemed right. Carol had prepared me thoroughly over the preceding weeks. I knew the order of witnesses, the documents that would be presented, the arguments Diane's attorney, a man named Ferris, expensive suit, imprecise eyes, would likely make. The opposing strategy, Carol had explained, will be to argue that the handwritten will is the anomaly, that Gerald was confused or impaired when he wrote it, that it lacks the formal requirements of a valid Ohio will, and that the notarized document represents his true intentions. She'd paused. They will not be expecting the full scope of what we have. We had Dr. Bell's complete forensic report, which had been finalized and ran to 41 pages. We had Patricia Owens, the notary, who had traveled from her home that morning and was sitting in the hallway outside the courtroom with her carbon copies and her meticulous records. We had Bill Garrett, who had submitted a written statement and was prepared to testify. And we had something Carol's investigator, Ray Dutton, had found during a deeper review of Gerald's financial records. A wire transfer, made 6 months before Gerald's death, from a brokerage account Gerald controlled to a joint account belonging to Diane and Trent. A transfer of $340,000, which corresponded exactly to a debt repayment record found through publicly filed court documents in Indiana. Diane and Trent had needed money. They had gotten some once, legally. And then Gerald had apparently stopped. And then 4 months after Gerald died, a will appeared that gave them everything. The hearing room was small. This was a probate matter, not a jury trial. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Patricia Moore, 60 or so, who gave the impression of having heard every variety of human misbehavior that a family could generate and retaining her capacity for impartiality despite it. She ran her courtroom efficiently and without theater. Diane and Trent sat at the respondent's table with Attorney Ferris. Diane was in black. Trent was in a gray suit that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent at the Clover Inn. Neither of them looked at me when I came in. I looked at them, though. I had time. I studied Diane's profile. The set of her jaw, the careful stillness she was maintaining. And I thought about the girl who used to fall asleep in the back seat on long drives, who called me from college at 11 p.m. because she was homesick and wouldn't admit it. I thought about all the ways love can be used against you by the very person you gave it to. Then I turned and faced forward. And I was done looking back. Dr. Bell testified first. She walked the court through her methodology: exemplar collection, pressure mapping, baseline analysis, in the even technical voice of someone who had done this many times before. When Attorney Ferris cross-examined her, trying to suggest her methodology was subjective, she dismantled his questions with the patience of someone correcting a student who hasn't done the reading. The signature on the probate will, she testified, showed clear signs of having been produced by someone other than Gerald Collins. The signature on the handwritten will was consistent with all known exemplars across decades of documents. Patricia Owens testified next. She identified Gerald from the photograph. She produced her records. She described the signing, the date, the time, the ID, the glass of water, the slight heaviness in his manner. She had the carbon copies, every page. When Ferris attempted to suggest her memory of a single appointment years prior was unreliable, she opened her binder and placed her carbon records on the witness stand one by one, quietly, without drama, like a woman who had been keeping careful records her entire professional life precisely because she understood that one day they might matter. The courtroom was very still during that moment. Even Judge Moore leaned forward slightly. Then Carol introduced the wire transfer. Ferris objected on relevance grounds. Judge Moore overruled him with one word: overruled. She was looking at the documents with an expression I had learned from years of reading people meant she had already drawn a conclusion and was waiting for the rest of the evidence to confirm it. It was during Carol's summary argument that I watched Diane and Trent for the first time with something other than grief. I watched them as people. Trent was very still, the stillness of a man trying to perform calm and not quite achieving it. His jaw worked slightly, the way it does when someone is grinding through options and finding them all closed. Diane had been composed through most of the morning, but when Carol cited the wire transfer, when Carol said the phrase, "pattern of financial extraction beginning while Mr. Collins was alive," I saw Diane's hand on the table tighten. Then she whispered something to Ferris. Sharp, urgent. And he placed his hand briefly on her arm in the way attorneys do when they are telling a client to stop talking. She pulled her arm away. Trent, beside her, did not look at her. They were no longer a united front. Whatever coordination they had walked in with was fraying under the weight of what was being said in that room, and I could see it happening in real time. People who build plans on lies have no contingency for the moment the lies are named out loud in a court of law. Then Carol said, "And we note for the record that Mrs. Collins was, in fact, directed to the detached garage as her sole inheritance, the same garage in which Mr. Collins had concealed the authentic testamentary document, apparently in anticipation of exactly this scenario." Judge Moore looked up at that. She looked at me briefly, then at the table where Carol and I sat, and then back at the documents. Ferris made his arguments. He called the handwritten will informal, procedurally questionable, potentially drafted under duress. He suggested Gerald had been lonely and anxious in his final months, and that the handwritten document represented a passing mood rather than genuine testamentary intent. He did not call Diane or Trent to testify, a decision that, Carol had predicted, would not go unnoticed by a judge experienced in probate fraud. Judge Moore did not rule from the bench that day. She said she would review the materials and issue a written decision within 30 days. Standard procedure. But when we stood for her exit, she paused at the door of the chamber and looked out over the room for a moment, the way someone does when they're organizing a thought. She didn't say anything. She went through the door. In the hallway afterward, Diane walked past me without speaking. Trent was 2 steps behind her. At the elevator, he turned and looked back at me once. I met his eyes. I did not look away. He got in the elevator. Carol touched my arm. "That went well," she said, which from Carol was the equivalent of someone else saying we won. I buttoned my coat against the January cold and walked out of the courthouse into the gray Ohio morning, and for the first time in months, maybe for the first time since that Tuesday in March when Gerald washed his coffee mug and didn't come back from the kitchen, I felt something that was close to peace. Close to was enough, for now. Judge Moore's written decision arrived on a Friday, 26 days after the hearing. Carol called me at 8:47 in the morning. I was at the diner on 5th, with coffee going cold in front of me because I'd been too nervous to drink it properly for the past week. I had ordered toast and not touched it. The waitress, a young woman named Petra, who had learned over the preceding months not to ask me how I was doing until I'd had at least half a cup, refilled my coffee without a word and left me alone with my phone on the table. "Martha," Carol said, "it's everything." I set down the cup. The decision ran to 18 pages. Carol walked me through it over the phone, but she also emailed it to me, and I read every word that afternoon sitting in my room at the Clover Inn with the heat going and the parking lot outside gray and quiet. Judge Moore had found, based on the preponderance of evidence, that the will filed in probate was not a valid expression of Gerald Collins's testamentary intent. She cited Dr. Bell's forensic report at length. She cited the testimony of Patricia Owens and the notary records. She cited the wire transfer as evidence of a pattern of financial manipulation and noted that the timing of the contested will's appearance, discovered only after Gerald's death, never discussed with his spouse of 45 years, inconsistent with his known estate planning discussions, failed to satisfy the burden of authenticity. The handwritten will, she found, met Ohio's requirements for a valid holographic will. It was entirely in Gerald's handwriting, signed and dated. The notarization at the UPS store, while unusual, had been properly executed and documented. Gerald's intent was clear. His language was unambiguous. The contested will was set aside. Gerald's estate would be distributed according to the authentic document. The house to me, half the investment accounts to me, and $3 million with the jewelry to Diane. And then there was a final paragraph. Judge Moore had referred the matter to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office for review of potential criminal charges related to the submission of a fraudulent instrument to the probate court. Fraud on the court, a felony in Ohio. I read that paragraph 3 times. I thought about Diane sitting across from me at the kitchen table with that flat, certain smile. I thought about Trent sliding into the booth at the diner on 5th with his hands flat on the table like a wall. I thought about the settlement offer slipped under my door at the Clover Inn. $2 million, as if 45 years of a life could be bought at a discount. All of it, every calculation they had made, had rested on the assumption that I would not fight, or that if I fought, I would lose. They had been wrong on both counts, and now the machinery of consequence, the slow, impersonal, utterly reliable machinery of it, was moving toward them the same way it moves toward everyone who mistakes an old woman's grief for weakness. Carol told me that Diane and Trent's attorney had already indicated they would appeal the decision. They can, Carol said, but the forensic evidence is solid, the notary testimony is solid, and the wire transfer pattern is on record. An appeal won't change those facts. It will cost them time and money they don't appear to have. They did file an appeal. It was denied 5 months later by the Ohio Court of Appeals in a 1-paragraph ruling that cited no new legal questions warranting review. The prosecutor's office opened an investigation. 6 months after Judge Moore's decision, Diane and Trent were each charged with 1 count of forgery, 1 count of fraud on the court, and 1 count of theft by deception, the latter relating to the unauthorized extraction of Gerald's funds during his lifetime. Trent was additionally charged with a securities-related offense that emerged from the investigation into their financial records, involving money that had nothing to do with Gerald and everything to do with a pattern of behavior that had been going on for years before any of this began. I did not feel triumph when I heard about the charges. I want to be clear about that. I felt a very specific, quiet kind of rightness, the way a thing feels when it has come back to where it belongs. Gerald had signed those papers in a UPS store because he feared this and wanted me to be safe. The court had found what he left for me. That was enough. My attorney filed the paperwork to retake possession of the house on Clover Street. By the end of February, nearly 5 months after Diane had told me to leave, I walked back through my own front door. The rose bushes along the fence were still dormant. The floors still creaked in the same places. The study, when I unlocked it with a key Carol had obtained through the estate process, was disordered. Files moved, boxes opened, but nothing of real legal importance had been removed. Most of what Diane and Trent had taken was documentation Carol had already replicated from financial institutions. I stood in the study for a long time. Gerald's handwriting was everywhere in that room, on folder labels, on the backs of photographs, on the notepad he kept by the phone. I had spent months being afraid in small, rented rooms, eating alone at diner counters, sleeping with the case documents on the nightstand because they were the closest thing I had to solid ground. Now I was standing in the room where Gerald had done his thinking for 30 years, surrounded by the evidence of his careful, quiet, decent life. And I was not afraid of anything. I felt him very strongly there, not as an absence, as a presence. I went to the garage and sat in the folding chair. Then I got up, went back inside, and made myself a cup of coffee. The house was mine. The estate was settled. The truth was in the record. Gerald had done his job. I had done mine. Spring came to Clover Street the way it always did in Ohio. Slowly, then all at once. By April, the rose bushes had new growth. By May, they were blooming, red and yellow along the front fence, the same as they had been for 20 years. I planted a new bed along the back porch, something I'd been wanting to do for years but somehow never found the time for. Gerald would have said the timing was right. I spent that spring and summer making the house mine in ways that grief and then conflict had prevented. I repainted the study, a warm cream color, lighter than it had been. I had the floors refinished. I bought a proper chair for the back porch and made a habit of sitting in it every evening with a book and whatever the birds decided to visit the feeder I'd hung from the eave. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things that are, in the end, the whole of a life. Ruth came up from Columbus in June and stayed for a week. We went through old photographs together and talked about Gerald and about our parents and about the way time moves, and neither of us talked about Diane more than once. There wasn't much to say that the court hadn't already said. Carol had connected me with a financial advisor through her professional network, a woman named Helen Park, who specialized in estate management for widows and retirees. Between the house, the investment accounts, and the settlement of Gerald's estate, I was not an enormously wealthy woman, but I was a comfortable one. I did not have to worry about money. That was Gerald's gift to me, the one he'd tried to protect from the beginning. I started volunteering at the hospital, something I'd thought about for years without doing. 2 mornings a week, sitting with patients who didn't have visitors, reading aloud or just talking. I was apparently good at sitting with people. I had, as Dorothy from the Bible study pointed out, a lot of practice. Bill Garrett and I had Sunday dinner together most weeks. He was a good cook, better than he admitted, and he had a large collection of old jazz records and a habit of telling stories about his teaching years that were either funny or quietly devastating, depending on the week. I liked his company. Gerald had liked it too. It felt like a thread of continuity. In September, Dorothy organized a small gathering at her house. The women from the Bible study, plus a few others from the church who had followed the story. They were not gossips, these women. They had simply been praying for me for months and wanted to see that the answer had come. I brought the cannoli from the Italian bakery on Maple Street. It seemed like the right thing. As for Diane and Trent, the criminal trial was scheduled for the following January. Their attorneys pursued negotiations with the prosecutor's office, and ultimately, both entered plea agreements. Trent pleaded guilty to fraud on the court and the securities charge. He received a suspended sentence, a $400,000 fine, and 3 years of probation. Diane pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of filing a false instrument. She received 2 years of probation, a fine, and was ordered to complete 200 hours of community service. Neither went to prison, which I have complicated feelings about. Carol said the plea deals were consistent with how Ohio courts handle first offense white-collar fraud by defendants with no prior criminal record. I understood the legal reasoning. I also understood that Gerald's entire life savings might have disappeared into their hands if I had not found that envelope. But I had found it. That was the point. The $3 million that Gerald had left Diane in the authentic will was technically still hers to receive. She received it, minus the fines. She and Trent moved away from Dayton to somewhere in Arizona, I was told by someone who had heard it from someone else. I didn't follow the news of their lives. It wasn't mine to follow. What I know is this. They had built their plan on the assumption that I was too old, too grieved, too alone to fight them. They had underestimated what Gerald had left in that garage. They had underestimated what 45 years of a good marriage looks like from the inside. The trust it builds, the way it teaches you to recognize truth even when someone is working very hard to hide it. The last Saturday in October, I drove to the UPS store across town. I went inside and asked to speak to whomever handled notary services. The woman who came out was young, late 20s maybe. I told her that a woman named Patricia Owens had worked here some years before, and that her careful record-keeping had made a significant difference in my life. I asked if she could pass that along, or if there was any way to reach Mrs. Owens. She took my name and number and said she'd try. 2 weeks later, Patricia Owens called me. She was retired now, living with her daughter in Kentucky. We talked for half an hour. I told her what had happened in full. She was quiet for a moment at the end, and then she said, "Your husband seemed like a good man." "He was," I said. "He wanted to do it right," she said. "He told me that." Yes, he had. And because he had, and because I found what he left for me, we did. Gerald always said that a person's true character is revealed not in what they do when things are easy, but in what they do when everything has been taken from them. I was 68 years old, alone in a cold garage, with nothing but an old blanket and a hidden envelope, and 45 years of knowing what my husband's handwriting looked like. That was enough. If you are ever told you are too old, too tired, too alone to fight for what is right, remember, sometimes the answer is already waiting for you in the place they forgot to look. What would you have done? If this story moved you, please share it and leave a comment. Thank you for being here.